Chilling tales for dark nights.
This is Jesse Brown, aka the voice of Insanity and winner of Chilling Tales for Dark Nights Evil Idol 2018 voice acting competition. I wanted to thank everyone who listened to and voted for me in this year's competition, including all of you in the listening audience and the 11 members of this year's judging panel. I couldn't have done it without your support. And I wanted to thank Chilling Tales for Dark Nights for their very generous $500 grand prize. I also want to thank my wonderful wife for all her support and encouragement. To celebrate the conclusion of this year's competition, and my being crowned this year's King of the Macabre, I present you with 10 of my favorite tales, all performed by me for your listening pleasure. So get settled in, and prepare yourself for more horror than you can handle. I look forward to performing more tales of terror for you in 2018 and beyond. Until next time, turn off the lights, and turn on the dark. I'm slowly losing my mind. It's been snowing in town for almost a month non-stop. School was canceled and nobody's on the road. I feel so trapped and helpless. Everything came to a head yesterday when I saw her. Anastasia Morozov, or as we all knew her, Annie, had been missing for about a month now and nobody could find any trace of her. Steven told me what happened that night in the mountains. How he and Jake left her in the woods, all for some stupid prank. Here I was thinking she got kidnapped, mauled by a wild animal. But no. The truth, or what I believed to be the truth, is a million times worse. Last night, I had been talking with Kate over the phone about the incident. There wasn't much else for us to talk about, honestly. We'd been stuck in our houses for so long we were sure our minds were slowly deteriorating. She told me how every night she would hear a voice just outside her window. But that's all that it was. Just the voice of a girl saying, "I'm cold." I'm not one to believe in the supernatural, so I told her it was just her imagination running wild from being cooped up for so long. Kate was going to tell me I was right, until she paused. She told me that she was hearing it again. That voice. This time, however, I could hear it too. Kate said she would be right back and put down the phone. All I could hear was static, like something was interfering with our signal. Suddenly our connection was completely dropped, and I couldn't call her back. I just figured that the storm was the cause of this and went downstairs to watch TV. Our house was cold, even with the heat cranked all the way up. My dad was outside shoveling, which was honestly pointless considering how hard the snow was coming down. I think he was just going as crazy as I was being stuck inside. I was about to turn on the TV when I heard a knock at our back door. It was soft, almost like whoever was behind the door was actually afraid someone would answer it. I could still hear the sound of my dad grunting and swearing in our front yard, so I knew it wasn't him. It knocked again. Now I was scared. I ran to the front door and swung it open. I yelled at my dad that someone was around back and he told me he would go look. I could hear his footsteps in the snow walking around the side of our house. After some time he tapped on one of the windows and shrugged. There was nobody there. All of a sudden I began to feel weak, like all the energy was slowly being sucked out of my body. I went upstairs to lay down in bed, but when I reached the door to my room, the doorknob was completely frozen. I panicked thinking the window in my room flew open or something and I would be greeted by a giant snowdrift instead of my bed. I pulled the sleeve of my sweatshirt over my hand and opened the door. You know that feeling when you think you're hallucinating, and for a moment all time seems to just stop? That's what I felt when I opened the door to the girl standing in my room. My mind was filled with a mixture of horror and confusion as I took a step forward. I called out to the girl, something I instantly regretted when she turned around. Her skin was blue-gray, and she had a pair of piercing blue eyes. She was wearing a cape-style coat that almost completely covered up her thin leggings and boots. The most distinguishing factor, however, was the dark gray beret she wore on her head. I knew instantly that this girl was Annie. She looked at me and smiled. "Hi, Margaret," she cooed. Her voice was ethereal and disembodied. I stood there in shock. My heart was stuck in my throat and I wanted to scream and cry all at the same time. But I couldn't. I wanted to hug her and tell her we missed her, but something about her now terrified me. Annie moved closer to me. "Do you want to see?" I started to regain feeling in my body and managed to answer. "See? See what?" I asked, consumed by fear. I never should have answered. I should have ran as fast as I could out of that house with my dad and just drove. Annie was closer now, so close that I could now feel her icy breath on my face. "See what they did to me," she said in a low, ghostly voice. I didn't get the chance to respond as Annie's face began to change. Her skin started to rot off sides of her face and her eyes fell out, leaving nothing but sad, dark, empty sockets. I started to cry and fell to the ground. This wasn't her, but at the same time it was. I'm so sorry, Annie. I choked, half-stricken with the painful sadness that gnawed at my throat, as well as this intense fear that my life was going to end then and there. The undead girl, or whatever she was, looked down at me. She put her ice-cold hand on my shoulder. "I'm cold, Margaret," she hissed in my ear. Her voice sounded evil, nothing like the sweet girl I'd attended school with for 4 years. I looked up into those dead, abyssal eye holes. An eerie, pale blue glow began to emanate from inside her body, like some sort of twisted soul trying to escape. "I'm cold," she hissed again, more aggressive than before. Her grip on my shoulder tightened and I thought she was breaking through my skin. I closed my eyes and screamed in pain as I summoned what remained of my strength to flail my body in hopes that I might break free. I felt the pressure disappear, but the pain still remained. I opened my eyes and searched frantically around my room for any sign of Annie, but she was gone. That was last night. My parents took me to the hospital this morning and I showed them my wounded shoulder. When we got to the hospital, the doctor confirmed that I had a severe case of frostbite. I just told him I was outside and wasn't dressed properly. I'm not sure what else I could have said. Even that sounded a little strange as it was in such an odd place. I was given medicine for nerve pain and instructed on what to do to take care of it. Luckily, they told me I should be fine, which did give me a sense of momentary relief. That feeling has long since passed, however. I'm petrified that the ghost, zombie, whatever the hell Annie had become, is going to come back for me. I still don't know how she got in the house in the first place. Hopefully I'll hear from Kate soon. I haven't heard from her since we got disconnected. Every time I try and reach her, all I can hear is that same distant, ghostly static. My eyes snap open. Was I asleep? It's impossible to tell. The darkness around me has blurred the lines between my waking and sleeping states, and I can no longer quite distinguish between dreams and reality. But it doesn't make a difference. It's all a nightmare. I hear the door to my cell open, and I recoil as the pale light from the hallway floods into my chamber. The man in the lab coat stands in the doorway. He beckons me by my name. I hate it when he uses my name. He tells me to come, and I obey, knowing by this point that resistance will only prolong my suffering. I stand weakly and gaze at him. "Very good," he says. "Come along." He leads me down the familiar white hallway past rooms full of ghastly experiments and terrible concoctions. But I know where we're going. We're going to the camera. "Here we are," he says. "We've reached our destination." He ushers me inside the small white room, his shoes clicking along the tile. On one side of the room is a small camcorder atop a silver tripod, and a tape recorder sits on the counter next to it. I hate this place. I wonder what deranged plot he will subject me to, what vile concoction he'll force-feed me in the name of science. My eyes fall on a container full of green liquid sitting atop the counter. "Are you ready?" he says. I try to respond, to say no, to beg him to let me go. But I know it's no use. I can barely remember the sensation of speaking, as my voice has been mutilated beyond repair by countless experiments and tests. All that I can create now are squeaks and wheezes. Good. Then let's begin. His skin is a sickly shade, almost green in the light. He presses record on both the tape recorder and the camcorder, and begins. "Hello, gentlemen. This week, my assistant will be testing a new solution that I have created to foster hair growth. This solution is entering human trials for the first time, and I am eager to see the results." He turns to me. "If you would be so kind." He picks up the green liquid. He holds it out, but I don't take it. I stare at it for a moment, remembering in a flash every such time as this. The camera, the lights, the room, and him, this sadistic devil of a man. His hand outstretched with some pill, some drink, some knife to tear apart the very fabric of my being. I explode, trying to scream, trying to curse, to strike the man, but my faint shrieks are only met with his iron grip as he holds me down and forces the serum down my throat. It tastes rancid. It makes me gag. Hot tears well up in my eyes as he rubs forcefully on my throat, making me swallow. "There now," he says, collecting himself. "We'll see the results in no time. That wasn't so bad, was it?" I feel the shame welling up inside of me, my eyes to the floor. I can't even remember who I am. So much of my memory has been cut out, and my mind is never released from the constant cycle of drug after drug after drug. Oh, no. The serum is beginning to have an effect. I close my eyes tightly and wait. It begins slowly, but begins to gather speed. I feel an itch over every part of my body. I begin to scratch, but quickly realize that I cannot satisfy every twinge at once. It's coming from my scalp, my arms, my chest, my back, everywhere. I feel something brush against the back of my neck. My hair is growing everywhere, all over my body, all at once. It's enveloping me, coming out of everywhere. My head, my eyelashes, my eyebrows, my arms, even my palms and feet. It's overwhelming and I panic. I can't see. All right, thank you, that's enough. I hear the man turn off his equipment and feel him grab me firmly, leading me out of the room. That was very helpful. He shoves me into what must be my cell, and bids me a parting word before closing the doors as I writhe beneath the never-ending lengths of hair racing out of my body. I enjoy our little experiments together. I'll see you next time, Beaker.
Welcome again to Muppet Labs, where the future is being made today. Well, we are just feverishly excited here at the labs.
The body of a young female was recently discovered in the basement of an abandoned 6-story building on North 12th Street. Without any positive identification, the forensics team suggested she was aged 19 to 21 years, and without any obvious signs of trauma, they were unable to theorize a cause of death. Her details were run through various databases, but she matched no missing persons on record, and an investigation determined that she had been dead for just short of a week. The only items found on the body were 2 pieces of paper in the back pocket of her jeans, and a silver crucifix necklace lodged in her esophagus. The following is a transcription of the audio file reading by the lead detective of the 2 papers found on the body. Detective Jason Fuller of the Police Department. Case number 02. November 5th, 1982. There is a physical address at the top of page 1. 6117 12th Street. This address matches the location where the victim's body was discovered. Okay. Page 1. Welcome to the Hell House, where terror lives. Congratulations, you have been gifted a very special invitation to a most unique Halloween treat. At Hell House, we are committed to providing a thoroughly immersive and terrifying haunted house experience, and as a premier guest, you have been selected to witness the horror in your very own private tour. For your safety, and the safety of our denizens, we strongly encourage that you read, understand, and follow the guidelines listed below. Number 1. Have fun. This is imperative. Our mission at Hell House is to provide an unforgettable experience. Number 2. Only guests 18 to 27 years of age are permitted to enter Hell House. Number 3. Creatures and features of Hell House and its affiliates are not allowed direct physical contact with any guest, under any circumstances, no exceptions. Number 4. A maximum of 2 guests are allowed inside Hell House at any time. Number 5. Weapons of any kind are strictly forbidden on or within Hell House property, including but not limited to guns, knives, and fire. If you pledge yourself to the above requirements, you may now enter Hell House, where further rules will be explained. Number 6. Implements of faith, crosses, Bibles, holy water, and prayers are aggressively forbidden on or within Hell House property. Failure to adhere to this rule will result in your automatic and aggressive exemption from Rule 3. Number 7. If or when you become separated from your party, please use the emergency exits conveniently located in the basement and the 8th floor window. Our employees are here to help you. Number 8. The doctor is real and is exempt in perpetuity from Rule 3 and 5. Under no circumstances are you to acknowledge the doctor's presence, lest you be held to the fullest extent of Rule 12. Number 9. If you should experience any sudden pain, nausea, paralysis, or explosive miscarriage, subsection 1A, during your visit to Hell House, seek the doctor's attention immediately. Number 10. Rule 2 does not apply to virgins or guests that are otherwise considered to be with child. Number 11. The basement is strictly off-limits to our guests. Failure to adhere to this rule will result in your automatic employment with Hell House. Number 12. To ensure authenticity, some scenes may depict loud noises, flashing lights, death, torture, personal fears incarnate, horrifying visions, and unauthorized third-party control. 13. Run. At Hell House, we like when you run. Subscript. Certain restrictions may apply. Second subscript. Hell House, Murder Mansion, and Cauldron of Sin are owned and operated by the Genesis Group, LLC. Subsection 1A. This system is not exclusive to just female guests. What the fuck? I'm falling forever, sinking deeper and deeper into a bottomless pit, stretching out into the infinite void. This madness has been my life for so long now. I often wonder if I will die as an old man before I ever reach the end of this eternal nightmare. But the situation I now find myself in is not how things have always been. I had friends, family, a home filled with my fondest memories. I had so many things that I took for granted each and every day of my existence. I would give anything to have it back. But alas, these dank walls have formed a prison around me. I'll never forget that day. The day my so-called friends lured me to that heinous place. "Come with us, George. It'll be fun. Everyone else is going." To this day, I know not whether my downfall was caused by sheer ignorance or by the machinations of some sinister plot. Irregardless of the circumstances, the outcome was the same. I was unwillingly brought to the top of that mighty tower. Before my mind could comprehend the horror that was to befall me, the Devil's Gate swallowed me whole. Fear and indescribable panic shot through my veins. I reached out in every direction, desperately groping for anything to cling to. But my hands found only smooth walls, slick with what I could only assume was the blood of my predecessors. There was no sound save for the thundering of my own heart in my head, and the light from above quickly faded. I had fallen so far and for so long that the fear had turned to dread. I floated in the thick atmosphere of my own hopelessness over the next few hours, days, years. To be honest, I'm not sure how long it was. Time is meaningless in this godless realm. After the first immeasurable era of time, the walls suddenly shifted around me. I felt them draw closer and closer to my helpless form. For the briefest moment, I thought the tunnel might squeeze the life out of me like a merciless boa. But before death took me, the tunnel altered direction. Carried by the speed accumulated from eons of descent, I was savagely thrown against the walls of my prison. With the first impact, I felt my arm buckle and snap. Blood poured from my newly broken nose as I crashed against the wall a second time. These recollections all feel so distant from me now, and yet my body is still racked with the pains of their memory. In my younger years, I pleaded with the deaf god to free me from this torment. But I have long since relinquished such childish fancies. Now I would settle for the warm caress of death's embrace. I think I see a light below me. Perhaps my penance has been paid. I care not whether it be salvation or annihilation. I only pray that the light liberates me from this hell. Goodbye, cruel world. I stood in darkness with my hand firmly wrapped around the doorknob. My wet clothes felt heavy against my skin, and my hair clung to my forehead. Nervousness and anxiety rippled throughout my entire body. I pressed my ear to the wooden door and listened closely. At first, silence was all that I heard in between the booms of thunder. Then I heard a subtle giggle. I pressed my ear harder against the cold wood. I could hear muffled moans and coos. I felt all my emotions melt into a boiling rage. What once felt like a pit in my stomach was now a roaring fire. I tightened my grip on the doorknob and thrusted my shoulder into the door. I stumbled into the room as splinters fell to the shag carpet. The motel room was as decrepit as you would imagine. Faded and stained diamond wallpaper flooded my vision, and a distinct moldy odor wafted into my nostrils. With glossy eyes, I looked at the couple lying bare in the worn bed. They stared at me, mouths agape, too terrified to even cover themselves. Katrina, why would you do this to me? My words seemed to jolt them from their shock as they scrambled for the covers. The man beside her started to speak. Listen, man, Shut your fucking hole, Aaron. Jack, please, I can explain this. A scowl flashed across my face. What's to explain, you cheating bitch? Everything seems pretty clear to me. I watched as the fear on her face turned to disgust. You're pathetic, Jack. If you were more of a man, I wouldn't have to sleep with other men. Without even realizing she had confirmed the truth. There were others. I had always suspected, but now I knew. I reached into my coat pocket and my fingers brushed against the cold steel. I withdrew the snub-nosed revolver and pointed it at her. Somehow it felt heavier than it did the night before. They stared at me, and I at them, in frightful silence. I didn't feel myself pull the trigger. I didn't even hear the crack of 2 gunshots. Instead, I only heard the pounding of my own heart and the rolling thunder. I stood and watched as the wrinkled white sheet slowly turned to a velvet red. Like a statue, I stood unmoving as the lights dimmed and the curtains drew closed. Only after the applause ensued did I allow myself to breathe once again. Flat and unrealistic. A newspaper was waved in my face before being thrown to the ground. I was caught off guard. What? Jason, what are you talking about? Our director and my longtime friend Jason Haverty spun around on his heels. The reviews from last night's premiere were ruined, Mark. The stout figure stood before me, arms at his hips. His head hung so low, you might not have known the expression on his face if it had not been for the silhouette of his mustache. Chris Richards, damn you. He sighed and squeezed the bridge of his nose. We can't go on tonight. And with that, he walked out in a huff. It was over just as quickly as it had begun. My fellow cast members and I were silent and gazed into empty space, like puppets without their master. It wasn't long before I found myself at the end of a bar, 7 empty glasses in front of me. After leaving the theater, the night had become a blur of bright lights and burning whiskey. But a sudden spark of lucidity offered me the chance to reflect on my thoughts. I had drunk myself into oblivion on many occasions before, but some nights were different. Sometimes I would find what many men before me had sought at the bottom of a bottle. A sort of clarity, if you will. Freedom in the sense that I could cut that which bound me to the statutes of this world. The rain poured down from the heavens that night, as if God himself had shed tears in the knowledge of what I had planned to do. I sat in the darkness, tightly gripping the heavy revolver. I wouldn't let him take her from me. He would struggle and lie about his part in the crime. But I was ready for him. Like a silent devil, I crept behind him as he hung up his coat. For a moment, I lingered behind, unsure if I could finish what I had set out to do. But my hesitation was quickly outmatched by my fury. With a forceful motion, I struck him down. Slowly, he began to stir. His eyes fluttered as he fought to regain consciousness. The way he so suddenly sat up, It was as if you could see the adrenaline pumping through his veins. With terrified eyes, he scanned the room. What was once his familiar abode had become a foreign place, occupied by an unknown danger. He tried to scream as I stepped out into the moonlight. Muffled cries of despair were all that came through the tape. I looked him over once more, making sure that he could not free himself from the chair. "I know what you have done," I said as I slowly encircled him. "I know who you are, Aaron, and I will not let you take her from me." His eyes flashed with confusion. I rested my hand and the revolver on his right shoulder. "It's all right. She probably lied to you. She probably told you that she was lonely. She's very good at manipulating people into doing what she wants. It's not really your fault. But I can't run the risk of you taking her. You can't have her." I spun him around and leveled his eyes with my own. "You will not take my Katrina." I stepped back and pointed the revolver at his head. Tears streaked down his face as he tried to beg for mercy. But as I pulled back the hammer, his expression changed. Mixed with his fear was a sort of understanding. I watched as his terror slowly mixed with something else. It was recognition. But how could he possibly know who I was? Katrina would never reveal my existence to one of her lovers. How did he know me? Against my better judgment, I slowly peeled the tape from his mouth. I knew I was running the risk of him screaming and attracting attention, but my curiosity won out. "It's you, isn't it?" His cryptic question only enraged me. Me who?" I said in a harsh whisper. I pushed the revolver into his neck. He quickly shut his eyes and began to whimper. "Him! You're him!" I let my gaze fall down to his tied hands. His finger was pointing towards the kitchen. Unsure of what to expect, I replaced the tape and walked across the room. My eyes searched the inky black. The kitchen was bare save for a bowl of fruit on the counter. But beside the bowl, shrouded in darkness, was a newspaper. I held it close to my face, desperately trying to read the pressed text. "Police confirmed yesterday night that the string of recent murders has indeed been the work of a serial killer. Details released indicate that the killer is targeting members of the art community. Officials denied any further comment." My mind raced as I read the text over and over. A serial killer? What did this have to do with me? Did he think I was some deranged murderer? Question after question filled my mind. As I mulled over each one, I began to hear a faint buzzing. Slowly it grew louder and louder. I gripped my head tightly as I realized that it was not a single noise, but an ocean of noise. A cacophony of whispers filled my mind. I felt myself sink lower and lower as each whisper became an earth-shattering bellow. "I might uphold the law in this town, but that won't stop me from putting a bullet in your chest. You will never take the earth, Zandor. Your invasion ends here. Any last words before you're tossed into the drink?" "You will not take my Katrina." I gripped the counter and heaved myself up, as if pulling away from a fatal drop. Level with my eyes was the knife block. Out of pure instinct, I gripped a handle and pulled one free. With a trembling hand, I held the blade to my throat. I knelt there, considering ending it all just to stop the noise. But I knew I couldn't do it. It was all theatrics. Suicide just wasn't in my nature. Still gripping the knife, I staggered back over to the frightened man. I'd lost my gun, but I didn't care. The knife felt so much lighter. Aaron, or whatever his name was, had witnessed the entire scene, and he had guessed how it would end. I leaned the chair back and stared into his eyes, red from tears. Slowly, I slid the tip of the blade between the buttons of his shirt and gently pressed it against his skin. Movies would have you believe that a knife will smoothly slide through a man's flesh, like butter. But this wasn't a movie. His skin held back the knife for a time, but eventually it gave way, almost with a subtle pop, like pressing your finger through a piece of Jell-O. Every few centimeters required more force to push the blade through. A smooth stab was impossible at this leisurely speed. Fleshy tendons and failing organs saw to that. Only for a moment did I pause when my hand reached his chest. Then, just as slowly and deliberately, I pulled the knife from his dying body. Warm, thick blood drained from him. It steadily oozed and trickled onto my hand. I watched in earnest as the color faded from his face, and the light left his eyes. Some may say that there is no light in a dying man's eyes, but there it was. I swallowed it whole and fed it to the ravenous voices in my head. Heeding the now gentle whispers, I positioned the body and cleaned the scene. They had done this many times before, but I was the uninitiated. I knew what I had done, and what would become of me if I were caught. And so, I was grateful for their wisdom. As the clock chimed 2, all was as it needed to be. I took in one final breath of air, reveling in the perfume of death. Then, I silently slipped out into the night. I looked around, unsure of my surroundings. A street I didn't know, littered with homes I had never seen. I buttoned my coat and shoved my hands into my pockets to guard myself from the cold of the night. As I walked down the street in search of a bus stop, I decided that I should learn to better pace myself when drinking. If I wasn't careful, I might do something I'd regret. "Quiet down back there," I yelled whilst driving down an all-too-familiar road. My best friend and his girlfriend wouldn't stop laughing loudly at nothing, much like young couples do. For what reason, I do not know. I almost regretted bringing them, but I didn't really want to go alone. And inviting one of these two lovebirds meant inviting both. They were a package deal. Luckily, the torturous sound of two young adults in love would soon cease, as I was approaching my destination. Finally, I would be able to loosen up. "We're here," I stated, less to point out our arrival and more to shut the two of them up. Fortunately for me, it worked. My aunt's old house was just as I remembered it. A rickety old cottage out in the middle of nowhere, down a dead-end dirt road, teeming with woods, wildlife, and the welcoming smell of roses that she would often plant outside near her stone walkway. That's when it finally hit me. While walking down that very walkway, smelling those very roses, I stopped dead in my tracks with tears welling up on the exterior of my eyes. "Are you okay?" my friend's girlfriend asked. "Yeah, I'm fine. I just need a second." They looked concerned, but they understood. What else would they expect of me coming back to my aunt's house right after she died? Honestly, it felt a little wrong. I may have been her favorite nephew, but after leaving me everything in her will, including her cottage, it seemed wrong to come here so soon. The service was held just a day prior. I knew everything she had wasn't much, and I knew I wasn't really here to collect on my inheritance. But I still felt bad. And at this moment, I felt even worse. The memories I had of her were being dredged up with every step down her walkway towards the front door. I hadn't seen her since I was 10 years old, but I could play every memory in my head like a movie. I was very close to her in those days. She might as well have been my mom. My actual mother cared for me, but she wasn't exactly loving like my aunt was. I remember coming here after school to some cliché milk and cookies. Instead of watching television like a normal kid, she didn't actually own a TV, I would listen to my aunt play the piano for hours on end. We would sometimes go bird watching or work in the garden, things that I have not done since then. These were some of my most treasured memories, but much like a treasure, I kept them locked up and hidden away for many years. Until now. I stopped dead in my tracks again before reaching the door. "Seriously, are you okay?" my friend asked this time, seeming very concerned. He had never seen me like this before. "I'm fine. Why don't you two take that hike you were talking about? I'll go on in and take a look around. You guys can meet me back at the car later." "If you say so." He seemed worried, but also a little distressed. Probably wondering why I brought him here in the first place if I was just going to send him away while I took care of things. It's true that I wanted someone here, but now that I've arrived, I know I have to do this alone. My friend and his girlfriend took off down a trail into the woods, and I was left standing there, looking at the house I had not seen in such a long time. The feeling that had overcome me was so strange. It's hard to put into words. It was more than grief. It was a greater sadness. It's funny. If my aunt could see me now, she probably wouldn't even recognize me. I was tall, bearded, and wore glasses, all of which obviously were not true of my younger self. This just made me sadder. With one last deep sigh of emotion, I marched on and reached for the handle on my aunt's front door. My aunt did not have locks on her doors or windows, including the front door. The house was constructed so long ago that it was not even built with them. Sure, she could have had some installed since, but she wouldn't really need them out in the middle of nowhere. She brought it up one of the first times I stayed here, saying, "Trust the world, and it will set you free." When I was a kid, hearing this made me feel safe. Being full-grown and recalling this statement now, I find it very peculiar. But then again, that was my aunt for you. Unpretentious and somehow oblivious to the rest of the world around her. Honestly, I miss that part of her the most. All of these memories came back to me piece by piece as I pulled the door open. The bittersweet release I felt was interrupted when I saw the inside of the cottage. Everything, and I mean everything, was exactly in its place. It was almost as if I was a kid again, coming over after school to enjoy my aunt's company. My memories were playing out right in front of me like a nostalgic outburst of energy. I could see my aunt sitting at the piano, playing as she often would. I could see me, sitting there, eating some homemade cookies, listening intently to the music. I could see her again cooking me dinner in the kitchen, as I sat on the couch reading one of her old books. It was surreal to feel all of this at once, but I walked past my living recollections and went upstairs to see more. I stopped quickly when I reached the top of the stairs. I realized that they only led to a single door, the attic door. Although my memories were coming back to me at an exponentially fast rate, I had forgotten about the attic. I had no interest in it, and so I traveled back downstairs. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. Maybe just a little peace of mind to put my heart at ease. Maybe just just something that would let me know without a doubt that my aunt passed away peacefully. I suppose the emotion I was experiencing was guilt. Yeah, that was it. When I was just shy of 11 years old, my parents moved out of state. This is when I stopped seeing my aunt. We kind of lost touch, especially seeing as she didn't have any real means of communication out there. No phone, no computer. She didn't even have a mailbox, and the nearest post office was over 20 miles away. Being older now, I could have easily paid her a visit, and I'm sure she would have loved to have seen me. I've always thought about it, but I guess I thought she would always be here too. Unfortunately, she had a heart attack young, and with no hospital or neighbors for miles, death came knocking on her unlocked door in a hasty fashion. At the very least, this visit has put the fleeting quality of life into perspective for me. At this point, this was probably the only thing that I could take away from this place. I may just leave it here to rest in peace, having found a little bit of closure to take home with me. As I made my way down the stairs and back into the living room, I noticed something. I was in such a hurry to escape my corporeal memories that I didn't notice this before. It was the desk. The desk where my aunt would sit and write for hours at a time. She said that it helped her experience the world outside of her cottage, by writing about how she imagined and wanted it to be. The more and more I remembered my aunt, the more I could see how isolated and somewhat unstable she really was. She was odd, but I loved her just the same, even now. What I had not noticed upon entering the house was that the desk drawer was open. I looked inside and found a single sheet of paper with my aunt's handwriting on it. This is what it said. To my dearest nephew, if you are reading this, then the cold tides of death have swept me away once and for all. I know that we've not seen each other since you were a child, but I hope you still think fondly back on our time together. I was happy to look after you, and I know that you were happy to spend time with me. I don't want you to be sad or feel off-put about my death in any way. This is how it was, and in turn how it was meant to be. I will always hold you dear in my heart, even after passing, and I'm sure you'll do the same for me. I want you to live freely despite this, and enjoy each and every moment of your life, just as I did mine. I will see you again someday, and I look forward to it. Trust the world, and it will set you free. P.S. Don't go in the basement. I shed a single tear reading this passage, knowing that my aunt wanted me to find peace in this old house. The very closure I was looking for was in this desk the whole time. The elation I felt almost distracted me from the postscript at the bottom of the page. Don't go in the basement. This last sentence had just now sunk in, and I noticed how out of place it was. Don't go into the basement? Why not? Was my aunt hiding something? If so, what was it? Without further ado, I headed over towards the basement door with the letter in hand, knowing that the answers I wanted were down there. I took one last look at the letter before opening the door. Don't go in the basement. It was so perplexing to me that I just had to know why. It was most likely the ramblings of an unstable woman on the verge of death. But what could be the real meaning behind it? Why the basement? And why me? I could recall the basement from when I was younger, but I didn't remember much. I had only been down there once. My aunt was out gardening while I was inside reading one of her books. I grew tired of reading and set the book down on her desk. Soon after, I began wandering around the house out of boredom. I walked around the entire cottage rather quickly, making sure to avoid the stairs. My aunt had told me once that they were old, and she had hurt herself falling down them, so I never went up them myself. I suppose this would explain why I didn't remember the attic door. Finally, I came upon the basement. Knowing my aunt wouldn't be in for a while, I decided to venture on. I turned to the doorknob and swung the door open. I could only see the top of the stairs descending downward into the darkness. I only hoped that these stairs weren't as rickety as the ones above. I pressed onward. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I couldn't see a thing. I started scrambling around looking for a light. After a few moments, I found an old string light in the middle of the room. I pulled the switch, and the room lit up, however dimly. What I saw disappointed me. It was a typical basement, only smaller. Concrete walls, concrete floor, and some old wood sitting off in the corner. Probably some old floorboards left over from the house's construction. As a kid, I had hoped for something a lot more interesting, given the mystery surrounding it. I had never been down there, and my aunt never talked about it. The next thing I remember was my aunt's voice as she came down the stairs, saying, "You can't be down here." She sounded less angry and more worried, probably that I would get hurt down there. I know that I had been down there longer than that, given the usual time that my aunt spent gardening, but this was all I could remember. Maybe going down one more time would refresh my memory. Maybe this could shed light on my aunt's strange message to me as well. Just as when I was a kid, I turned the knob and swung the basement door open, revealing only the top of the stairs and the basement below, completely void of light. Instead of feeling adventurous like I had back then, I now felt nervous, repeating the words my aunt had left for me over and over again in my head, and then asking myself once more, why? I crept down the stairs slowly so as to not shake the foundation. That's what I told myself, but I guess my sluggish pace was largely due to the fact that I was frightened at what I might find when I reached the bottom. Feeling impatient and uncomfortably anxious, I moved a little bit faster. I felt the concrete below my feet and I rapidly darted towards the center of the room, reaching for the light, praying that it still worked. I felt around for the string, found it, and pulled the switch. To my delight, it still harbored electricity. The room became dimly lit. In a panicky state, I spun around looking every which way as I did. What I saw surprised me. There was nothing there. It was just as I left it when I was a kid. There were even the old floorboards left in the corner, untouched for many years. I felt relieved, but far more confused than before. Why didn't my aunt want me to come down here? Instead of dwelling on the conundrum at hand, I chalked it up to asbestos or mold in the cellar walls. This could explain why she didn't want me playing in here as a kid, and why she didn't want me here now. She just wanted to keep me safe. This theory made me feel better, but deep down, I knew that couldn't have been the reason for my aunt's plea. Just as I made my way to the stairs, I stopped dead in my tracks for a third time while here at the cottage. Everything was coming back to me. I could remember being here in the basement when I was younger, the same as it was now. The same, that is, except back then there was a door. A door that led to the attic. What a strange memory to have kept bottled up for so long. How could I have forgotten? I remember clearly finding a door down here, and upon opening it, I entered the attic. I knew it was the attic at the time because I could peer out the window and see my aunt gardening 2 stories below. I remember waving to her, but she was too busy to notice me. I remember finding it odd at the time that I went from the basement to the attic without so much as climbing a single step, but I brushed it off. After all, I was only 10, and I had no interest in getting caught up in the semantics of how a house is built. I never thought about this incident again. Until now, that is. Now, being older, I am deeply perplexed and troubled by this memory. How can a basement lead me to the attic? How? It isn't even remotely possible. I still don't remember that day very well. The details are a bit fuzzy. I can only remember looking out the window at my aunt. It must have been a dream. That is the only explanation. I must have dreamt about finding the door in the basement after going down there that day. Yes, that's it. It has to be. How else could any of this make sense? Comfortable with my new hypothesis, I decided to go back upstairs. Before doing so, I turned around to take one last look at the basement. I really shouldn't have. I really shouldn't have. There in the middle of the far left wall of the basement was the door from my memory. I squinted and rubbed my eyes, keeping them closed for a good few seconds before opening them again. When I did, the door was still there, as tangible and existent as ever. Needless to say, I was in a slight state of shock. This can't be. It just can't be. I knew for a fact that the door was not there just a few moments before, and had already convinced myself that my childhood memory was nothing more than a bizarre dream. What was going on? Much like before, I knew that I had to move forward in order to satisfy my insatiable curiosity and answer the pressing questions that lay before me in the shape of a door. I had no choice. After regaining some composure and mustering up a small amount of courage, I walked, however slowly, towards the inexplicable door. My unhurried movements mirrored my hesitant and frightened exterior, allowing me to stall for a moment while I searched for some nerve to actually open the door. Unfortunately for me, the basement was small, and the space between me and the door was quickly covered in a matter of seconds, despite my slothful motion. The moment of truth was upon me. I took a deep breath, turned the knob, and pushed the door open, letting momentum take care of the rest. This was it. I might finally have the answers I had come down here for. Or should I say, up here? I couldn't be certain at this point. The only thing I was sure of was the beating in my chest. As the door opened, I became focused on nothing but my field of vision. What I was about to see would shed some light on the questions that had been raised since arriving at my aunt's house. The door creaked in an eerie manner and revealed the room behind it. Lo and behold, the room was none other than the attic. It was just as I remembered it, window and all. How can this be? The sunlight from outside came through the window and lit up the room brilliantly, leaving me awestruck. I walked forward to look outside, just to make sure that this was really happening. To make sure that this was indeed the attic, and that I hadn't gone completely crazy. After peering out the window, that question was still up in the air. 2 stories below was my aunt's yard. The grass was as green as ever, and the sky was as clear as day. Everything was so vibrant. I looked over at my aunt's garden, and to my surprise, there was a person there. It was a woman, and she was gardening. Who was that, and why was she in my aunt's garden? She turned around, revealing her face. And to my surprise, it was my aunt. What? How? My aunt is dead. This can't be happening. It just can't be. My private rant was interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind me. Startled, I remained frozen in place. "Who are you?" I heard echo off the attic walls. It sounded like a kid's voice. I turned around to face the voice. What I found was unsettling. It was my 10-year-old self, standing just 20 feet away from me, asking who I was. My mind was in such a delirious state by now that I didn't even question the out-of-place occurrence standing before me. I decided to converse with myself. I'm a friend. That's all I could think to say. You're a friend of my aunt's? He asked innocently. I had forgotten how curious I was as a child. Yeah, a very dear friend. My younger self walked over to look out the window where I was standing. I stepped aside to let him do so. He saw our aunt outside gardening below and waved at her. She didn't notice. Do you have an aunt? He asked while looking straight up at me. Yes, but she passed away, I said. I'm sorry to hear that. I also had forgotten how polite I was as a child. I guess my aunt taught me that. Listen to me, I know it's hard for you to understand right now, but someday your aunt will pass away too. I want you to spend as much time as possible with her and visit her whenever you can. You mean the world to her, and you will regret it later on if you don't make an effort to be with her now, while you still can. I relayed the only message I thought could help the younger version of me as he grew older. He looked at me with the most understanding stare, as if the events behind this message needed no further explanation. Okay, is all he said. That's all he needed to say. After walking around and looking at some old stuff in the attic, including some old books that caught his eye, my younger self left the attic to venture back to the basement and shut the door behind him. I looked out the window and noticed that my aunt had finished gardening and was walking back to the house. This was when my next revelation had taken place. I was beginning to remember more and more from that day. It was all coming back to me. I remembered me, standing here in the attic, the friendly bearded man with glasses. I remembered all of this now, from the conversation we just had to discussing it with my aunt afterwards. Just then I heard more footsteps in the next room. This time they were my aunt's. I ran over to the door and listened. You can't be down here, she yelled in a worried tone. I wanted to open the door and confront her, just to see her one last time and tell her that I'm sorry for never visiting. I reached for the doorknob, but I thought it best to leave my apology unspoken. That, and I was scared of what might happen if I opened the door. She would probably have just thought that I was an intruder. Like I stated earlier, she wouldn't recognize me all grown up. I could hear her scolding me and bringing me back upstairs. Instead of listening to find out what happened next, I just remembered. I could recall telling my aunt about the attic door in the basement and the friendly bearded man in said attic. I can remember her telling me that I had quite the imagination, but at the same time, I remember her looking troubled when I told her everything, especially after I told her what the bearded man had said to me. She seemed to know more than she was letting on, looking back on it now. As far as being in the attic, I remember it feeling just as it does now. The vibrant colors and surreal surroundings made it feel very dreamlike. Maybe this explains why, much like a dream, I had forgotten all about it. This attic seemed so disconnected from the rest of the world. Incredible at first, it was now beginning to make me feel uneasy. I suppose it was now time for me to leave. I headed back to the door and jiggled the knob. It wouldn't budge. I turned it a little bit harder, but to no avail. I began to feel a wave of terror consume me. This didn't make any sense. The doors in my aunt's house had no locks. Then again, nothing else made sense up until this point either. I backed up a little and ran into the door. It remained unmovable. I did this a few more times for good measure. Nothing happened. Feeling weary, I sat down and took a breather. Maybe if I just relax and rest my eyes, I can... Before I knew it, I had fallen asleep. The otherworldly properties of this room may have attested to this. A good couple of hours must have passed before I awoke. I opened my eyes gradually, rubbing them as I did. In a half-asleep daze, I took a look at my surroundings. I was still in the attic. I jolted up, now fully awake, and tried the door again. It would not give in, even still. What was I going to do? My thoughts were interrupted by audible footsteps and voices in the house. It was my friend and his girlfriend. I almost forgot that I had brought them here with me. I was saved. In a relieved stupor, I began calling out to them. It became quickly apparent, though, that they could not hear me from wherever I was. I could hear them walking around, calling out my name. I increased my volume and started banging on the door. "I'm in here, guys!" I yelled, still not knowing whether I was below or above them. They still couldn't hear me. I began to panic. I started screaming at the top of my lungs and banging as hard as I could on the attic door. I still received no response. With a dead voice and pained hands, I simply gave up. I put my back against the wall and slid down to a sitting position, with a few tears streaming down my face. I just sat there and listened as my friend and his girlfriend conversed from within the house. Where could he be? He said he would meet us back at the car, and he wasn't there. If he's not here in the house, then where else could he be? My friend asked his girlfriend. Did you try the basement? She asked. Yeah, there's nothing there but some old floorboards. What about the attic? She asked. I tried there too. It's just filled with a bunch of old, dusty antiques. We'll have to call the police and have them look for him too. He must have gotten lost in the woods looking for us. I appreciated my friend's girlfriend's efforts, but I knew they would heed no results. As they made their way out of the cottage, my heart sank. If he had already been in the basement and the attic, then where was I? My mind was racing. I came here for answers, and I found none. Instead, I'm trapped in the attic for what I can only guess will last an eternity. I quietly sobbed in the corner when I remembered something. As a kid, I looked at some old books up here. I could only remember the title of one of them. It was called A Rough Guide to Witchcraft. I remember finding the book to be an odd part of my aunt's collection, just as I do now. I jolted up once more and began looking through some of my aunt's old books. I started throwing them all over the place until I came across the one I was looking for. Yes, here it was. I still don't know why I thought it would help, but I was so desperate that anything seemed like a light at the end of the tunnel now. I opened it up and read the preface. The spells in this book are to be followed precisely. If even one step is not followed properly, you could potentially open a can of worms so horrific and convoluted that it may never shut again, and you will bear the consequences of your failure. Use these spells at your own risk. The odd nature of the preface loaded my nerves with a sense of worry. I was not liking where this was going. Before turning the page, I noticed the old lace bookmark, usually hanging from the book, was inside. I opened up to the page and read aloud. Chapter 8. Horticulture. I glanced over at the next page and noticed a spell meant to bring your garden to life. The spell itself was in Latin. It was meant to be enunciated while performing a ritual that included surrounding the area in a special sand I had never heard of, and the usual lighting of multiple candles. My Latin was a little rusty, but from what I could read, it said something along the lines of, bring above that which is below, which I assumed referred to the growing of the plants. I could only gather that my aunt performed the ritual here in the attic, because there were some dormant candles in here with her stuff. The inclusion of this book in my aunt's collection now made sense to me. She wanted to spice up her dull garden, and instead of taking care of the plants normally, she resorted to witchcraft. Was my aunt a witch, or did she just dabble in it for a while? After reading the entire book before and after Chapter 8, I believed you purchased the book just for that one spell. I couldn't find any reasons in the book for what was happening to me, but I could only gather that my aunt didn't know what she was doing, and did not follow the instructions to a T like she should have. This failure resulted in this. What is this exactly? I can only assume that this is the consequence as mentioned in the preface. My aunt did indeed open a can of worms, and in doing so, I can no longer open the door back into my normal life. I am stuck here in this illusory attic, an attic that seems to be a realm of its own. The only comfort I find is in knowing that I gave my younger self some great words of wisdom that I already know he heeded, whether he knew it or not. I may not have visited her when I grew older, but I did make the most of my time with her when I had the chance. For this I am glad, even if she was the reason I was trapped here. I am growing now to accept my fate. She did warn me after all. I should have listened. This is my fault and mine alone. With the endless paper and writing materials here in this old attic, I am left with nothing to do but write down in words what has happened to me, in the hopes that someone may come across it, somehow. The words of a living ghost. If you are reading this, please listen to what I have to say. Your time here is not boundless, and at any moment the horrid hand of the unknown could come knocking at your door, there to bereave your loved ones and steal away from your blissful, ordinary existence. The cause of this sudden upheaval will most likely be death, or in my case, something far worse. Last but not least, if you are ever in this neck of the woods, and you feel a need to stop in and say hi, go right ahead. I can't promise that you'll get a response. I just want you to remember two things. Your life is fleeting, so spend your time wiser than I did. And whatever you do, don't go in the basement. I love horror. Stephen King, Saw, Tales from the Crypt. I love it in every shape and form. Even as a young boy, I would seek out every edition of Goosebumps I could get my hands on. I never really understood my fascination, but it's always been there. Naturally, my parents were worried. I didn't play any sports, I wasn't part of any clubs, and I didn't have any real hobbies aside from reading. I'm sure by now you can guess what genre I typically stuck to. I love my parents, and I understand why they did what they did. I think most parents would have done the same. But that doesn't make it any easier to get over. You see, my parents never really understood my passion for horror. All they could see was that their son was more interested in gore and blood-soaked terror than playing in Little League. My childhood and early teen years are a blur, if I'm honest. Doctors, pills, nurses, care facilities, psychiatrists. It's all kind of jumbled together. But in my moments of clarity, I always noticed that something was missing. Like a piece of me had been taken. It had been so long since I'd read a book or watched anything remotely scary that I couldn't figure out that it was horror that was missing. My recollection is clearer after my release. A piece of paper declared me sane, and I went back to living with my parents. Obviously, they tried to shelter me for as long as they could, but it wasn't long before I rediscovered my obsession. As I drank in the image of her pooling blood, I realized it was this that had cost me years of my life. I finally understood that I needed to make a change. I needed to make sure I was never caught. So I carried out my pleasure only in times of solidarity. I would gorge myself on as much terror as I could find when my parents were at work. They had hired someone to look after me, but she rarely paid attention to me or my activities. And it was easy to mask what I was watching or reading on the rare occasion that she did check. I relished in my new old habits. Every day was a new opportunity to explore the malevolent elements of human imagination. But as the years went on, my passion faded. The unexpected twists became patterns. The blood had lost its crimson shine. The darkness had lost its allure. Solemnly, I wondered if horror was now lost to me. But as I said, I love horror. And I soon found that she loved me as well. Pale images of horror in the day were replaced by gleaming new terrors in the night. The flat scares of the outside world were no match for my own imagination. My mind had become clay for my mistress, and she filled my heart with fear. The demon that darts across the room in the corner of my eye, the specter always watching from over my shoulder, the murderous jester under my bed. These were all gifts from her. And what ghastly gifts they were. Whenever the sun fell beyond the horizon, a new nightmare on Dream Street was waiting for me. These were such fantastic new horrors. I knew that I couldn't keep them all to myself. I came to learn that I was meant to share this new darkness. An untapped well of fright, just waiting to be exposed to the world. Like I told you before, I loved my parents, and so they were first. I wanted them to understand the love of my life. It took some time, but eventually they understood. They had finally felt the terror in their hearts as I did. We're a much happier family now. Mom hasn't stopped smiling since that day. Dad is finally losing that weight he's been really trying to get rid of. They're such wonderful people. I bet they'd love to meet you. I might give them a bath before you come over, though. They're starting to smell. My parents died in a car crash when I was 14. Don't feel bad for me or anything. I've made my peace with that years ago. Life with them was never great, but I do miss them. It's just that if they taught me one thing, it's to not sit around wallowing in self-pity. I just wish they hadn't sent me to live with my Aunt Louise. Anyone have that one family member that's just a little strange? A little cut off from the rest of the family. Aunt Louise was ours. She was also our closest living relative. Dad's family lived on the other side of the continent. Mom's parents were both dead, and she was an only child. Aunt Louise, her mother's sister, actually, so my great-aunt, lived just an hour from where we did. When my folks were alive, we rarely visited Aunt Louise, and to be perfectly honest, I half expected her to refuse to take me in. I was fully prepared to become a ward of the state, or move across the country, as soon as I heard that the Children and Family Services had contacted her about taking me in. But she accepted. I'm not sure how willingly or graciously, but because I wasn't privy to the phone conversation where she agreed to take me. I was surprised, though, at how nice she was to me the first 3 days I was there. I want to make something clear. While Aunt Louise was cranky, odd, eccentric, uncouth, and several other less than flattering adjectives, she wasn't a complete bitch. She had a rather abrupt, even abrasive way of speaking, but she wasn't cruel. I had never taken the time to really get to know her during my initial 14 years, but I could tell that she mostly kept to herself, and didn't particularly like people. So naturally, I assumed that she was a reclusive, curmudgeonly bitch. Really, what surprised me the most when I first moved in is how normal everything seemed. At least at first. Aunt Louise cooked, cleaned, watched TV, talked to the neighbors on the phone, etc., just like anyone else would. And she told me right away that she had little in the way of expectations from me, or at least none that my parents wouldn't have. Don't stay out too late, let her know if you're going to be late coming home, finish your homework before you watch TV, clean up after yourself, etc. There was one rule, however, that was strange, and it stood out from the other rules in how strange it was. At first, I had tried not to worry about it. Old people sometimes have peculiarities. I initially thought that was all this was. I was wrong. She insisted that at any time I entered or left a room, I was to shut the door behind me right away. It didn't matter if I was only going to be in that room for a few seconds. If I entered a room, I was expected to immediately shut the door, and the same was true if I left it. I often forgot this rule in my first week or so there. She never failed to remind me of it. "Shut that damn door!" she would yell any time I forgot. It never seemed to matter where she was in the house. She could always tell when I had not shut a door after just opening it. Her house was old, and my understanding is that she was not its first owner. She had lived in it since Mom was a girl. I had no idea how old it was. It could have easily been over 100, judging by its design and layout. It had 2 floors, a basement and a sub-basement. That last floor threw me for a bit of a loop when I discovered it existed. I was washing a load of my clothes when I noticed a door, closed naturally, in the far wall of the utility room. The basement was unfinished, with mostly dirt flooring and bits and bobs stacked or piled or shelved everywhere. The only room you could really walk through without fear of stepping on something or knocking over a stack or pile was this laundry room, which was also the only tiled floor down there. The door I found in the basement had a board laid across it, easily movable. It was as if Aunt Louise wanted a border there, but not one that she couldn't get past if need be. My curiosity overtook me the second time I saw it, and I slid the board away from the door and tried it. It was locked. This didn't strike me as at all strange right away. That is, until I realized that this was the only room in the house, other than the doors leading outside, that Aunt Louise kept locked. I asked her about it one day while she was cooking. "The door in the basement?" she answered. "That's the sub-basement. Not much down there. I mainly keep my preserves down there. It's cool enough for them to keep." "Right," I answered. This didn't really explain why she kept it locked. "So if I ever wanted to take a look around down there..." "For the love of Christ, boy, why would you want to do that?" I noticed with that response that her face had changed. Aunt Louise mostly wore the same expression, a scowl like someone had just tracked a mud into her freshly shampooed carpet. Again, she wasn't as nasty as her expression indicated, but it was the expression she was most used to making, apparently. But when she responded to my desire to see what was behind that door, her eyebrows raised and her mouth quivered for just a second before answering. It was so slight, others might not have noticed it, but by that time, I knew enough about Aunt Louise to equate that with a scream of horror. I knew then that I had to see what was behind that door. I've always been a curious type, you see. I've never been able to stay away from something that aroused my curiosity, even if my good sense told me better. I wanted nothing more after that than to see what was in the sub-basement. But how was I going to get around the lock? That was going to be an issue. Aunt Louise kept all of her keys on a single ring. There weren't that many of them, but I figured if the door to the sub-basement was anywhere, it was there. I just had to find a way to take it from her. This turned out not to be so simple. For one thing, it was not possible to get around the house without being heard. I couldn't sneak from my bedroom to hers in order to sneak the keys without opening and closing all doors in between us. Mine, the door in the far part of the hallway, and hers. Believe me, even if I simply left all the doors open, she somehow knew. Once, I had to go to the bathroom in the night, and I forgot to close the hallway door. I had just made it to the bathroom when I heard her yell, even while asleep, "Shut that damn door!" I hurriedly turned back and went to close the hallway door, forgetting to close the bathroom door, and I heard it again. "Shut that damn door!" For that matter, Aunt Louise's room had a squeaky door that also had a catch to it. When she opened it, it sounded like a... There was no opening of her door without her noticing. So I forgot about the sub-basement door for a while. I placed my curiosity on the back burner and just tried to get along with the taciturn old woman for a while. Life got a little bit easier. As long as I remembered to keep all doors shut at all times, the two of us got along famously. She didn't get in my face about things, and I didn't get in hers. It was a pretty silent house, but one that I got used to living in. I didn't even think it strange anymore that every part of the house that went access through a door always had its door shut. It would have struck me as more odd if any doorway was ever left open. Which brings me to the day Aunt Louise fell asleep while watching The Price is Right. It was a summer day and pretty hot. Louise was slightly less worried about windows being open than doors, but she still tended to only open one at a time. And today she had just one open. One that wasn't doing much at all to cool down a boxed-in house that had zero room for airflow thanks to Aunt Louise's chief eccentricity. So naturally, she fell asleep, and I saw my chance. Her purse was at her feet. I was sitting in the chair directly beside hers, reading an Avengers comic book and trying to ignore the repeated calls of... from the TV. I looked over at her and saw she was in a deep doze. Her hearing wasn't the greatest even when she was awake, though she was far from deaf, but I figured in her snooze, there would be little chance she would hear the tiny noise of me rifling through her purse. I found her keys almost immediately and headed to the stairwell. If she woke up when I opened the door, I would just claim I was doing a load of laundry. But she was unlikely to wake unless I forgot to close the door, which by now I never did. I headed down the stairs, for some reason tiptoeing even though I wasn't yet at the place I had been shut out from. I felt absurdly guilty, despite the fact that Aunt Louise had never expressly forbidden me from doing what I was now doing. The door to the basement was closed, of course, but unlocked as always. I ducked through and closed it, waiting a few minutes, listening for a shifting of Aunt Louise's frame in her chair, indicating that she was getting up. Or perhaps her voice calling to ask why I had gone into the basement. Quietly, I crept for the laundry room, opening the door and closed it just as quick, slipping inside. I felt for the chain pull for the light and pulled it. Low, eerie light flickered through the room. I'd never thought of the lighting in here as eerie before, but I did now. There was something about this entire endeavor that just felt wrong. But my curiosity overrode my sense of caution. I crept toward the door and slid the board away from it. Aunt Louise had apparently put it back in place after the last time I had done this. The question of why she had done so played in my brain for another moment, but I ignored it and brought out the key ring. I found the right key on the third try, and heard a loud chuck of the lock sliding away. I froze, heart beating in my chest, waiting to hear a cry from upstairs. Nothing. The door opened silently as a ghost. There wasn't any light to illuminate the staircase beyond. I didn't even see a chain pull for a light on the stairs. My brain was screaming at the rest of my body to turn around and forget this little adventure. But I paid it no heed and crept down the stairs, feeling along the wall for guidance. It turned out that there was a tiny amount of light coming through the vents in the ceiling. It wasn't much, but I could see that there was a pull string light just a few feet from the foot of the stairs. Stupid place to put it. It should be right at the landing, but I walked down what appeared to be a fairly compact hallway and pulled the string. If at all possible, the light that flickered on was lower than the light from the laundry room. I could barely tell that I'd turned it on. I looked around and saw that, indeed, Aunt Louise did have rows of preserves down here. I was somewhat disappointed at the mundane answer to the mystery. For a moment, it seemed that the secret sub-basement was exactly what it was supposed to be. Except, I could feel a puff of a warmish breeze that should not be possible down in the hard-packed earthen walls and cooler subterranean air. The sense of wrongness was still there and still strong, and I realized that the long row of shelves holding jars ended in a doorway at the end. A doorway that didn't have a door. I crept forward, arms in front of me, stepping carefully. The room beyond the door was dark and smelled musty. I couldn't feel a source of the slightly warm air that was brushing against my skin. But I was noticing that the closer I got to that room, the warmer the air became. By the time I was at the mouth of the tunnel, somehow I had started thinking this place was a tunnel by this time, the air wasn't just warm. It was humid, fetid. The smell went from musty to moldy to something even worse. I was assailed by that sense of wrongness stronger than ever before. I had to get out of here. Why was I walking even closer? There wasn't much light, but I could see the outline of another door on the other side of the room. It was ajar. Seeing a door ajar in Aunt Louise's house was like seeing a shattered window in anyone else's. It was wrong. It was not meant to be, but then I wasn't precisely in Aunt Louise's house anymore, was I? This tunnel was not built for this house. I knew that in my soul. It was here before, long before. This was a place that had only become attached to Aunt Louise's house by short-sighted builders, unaware of what they had unearthed, what they should have left buried. It took me a moment to realize that the room beyond, the very room I was about to step into, was moving. The light was too dim to really see what was happening, but there was motion beyond it. Unceasing, slow, lazy motion. All along the walls and the floor. I could hear a slight squelching noise from its every corner. Things were crawling, expanding their pulpous flesh, and looking at me, daring me to cross the floor and shut the door on the far side, forever closing out what might be coming through it. I heard sucking sounds. Some formless, gelatinous presence stretched and flexed in the darkness. In that moment, a sense of understanding came to me. I was not the first person to stand at this door. This door that could not be closed. Not the first person to see that door. The one that was not meant to be. Standing open on the other side. And knowing that it always would. Until someone worked up the courage to cross the threshold and close it. Aunt Louise had not the courage, so she fled, and kept every door in her house closed at all times, hoping against hope that keeping her doors closed at all times would alert her when whatever was beyond that damn door finally came for her. I didn't have the courage either. I turned and fled and never looked back. When I was 16, I moved out of Aunt Louise's house into a halfway house. When I was 18, I got a job upstate and moved there. I never went back to Aunt Louise's and never called her. I tried hard to not even think about her. But I haven't been successful. I still think back to the day I stood at that doorway, about the squelching, wriggling things that waited in the dark. And I wonder if Aunt Louise ever found the strength to cross the room and shut that damn door. A couple of months ago, I began my classes at Chico State University. As I was preparing for my freshman year, I was able to find everything that I needed, except for a laptop. I'm not exactly very good at letting $1 go for something, especially when I could get that something for less. I scoured the internet for good deals on laptops, finding none that really suit my frugal habits. Classes were only 2 weeks away and I was becoming desperate for a computer. Several days later, I saw an ad in the newspaper for a laptop that was being sold for only $600, and not too far from where I live. It was a very nice Dell laptop too, seeming odd that it was being sold for almost $1,000 less than the store price. I drove to the seller's address the following day. The house was farther out of the city, butting up to a dense forest. Outside of the house was an old Chevrolet and a mess of old signs and other various vintage-looking items. I rang the doorbell and a thin man in a flannel jacket came to the door. When I asked about the laptop, he looked almost relieved and told me he was ready to sell it immediately. Luckily, I came with cash in hand, and after proof of good condition, I went home with a new computer. Excited to have my first self-bought laptop, I powered it up and began uploading my own programs and applications onto it. Upon searching the hard drive, I found a folder hidden away on it, which was odd because the man selling it told me that the memory had been wiped and was ready for a fresh start. The folder was titled 9/17/10, presumably a date. I opened the folder revealing 6 photos and 3 pictures. Curiosity got the best of me and I decided to watch the videos. The first video was simply titled 001. The video was shot from a shaky camcorder inside of a vehicle, recording a woman walking out of a bar and getting into her car at night. After a couple of seconds, the woman drove off, and almost immediately, the person recording the video began to drive after her. The video ended after 24 seconds. It almost seemed like the cameraman had been waiting for the woman for a while. Come to think of it, I wasn't too alarmed by this at the time, just a little unsettled. I opened the next video file, titled 002. I assumed that this was the next part of the first video. My assumption was right, as it began with the camera on top of the console, facing out of the windshield. It was raining now, leading me to believe that this was a short while after the first video ended. I could barely make out that the vehicle 2 cars ahead of this one was the same car that the woman at the bar left in. This went on for an unsettling 47 seconds before the camera cuts out. I began to get a little nervous, fearing that this might take a turn for the worst. But, as if watching a television show, I wanted to see where this was headed. Not totally concerned yet, I decided to press on. The third video was, of course, titled 003. This was the one that got me officially concerned. The clip began from the same shaky hands as the first clip. There's now pouring rain outside of the car, and I could barely make out a figure in a fur coat with an umbrella walking to the front door of a house. I could only assume who this person was and whose house this belonged to. The figure entered the house and closed the door. The following stillness greatly unnerved me. The only thing that could be heard was the sound of the rain dumping on top of the car. After roughly 2 minutes of this nerve-wracking nothingness, the lights inside of the house cut out. Another minute or so went by before the camera was placed on the console again, and the sound of a person exiting the car broke the stillness. After the car door quietly closed, another figure, this time hooded, could be seen walking towards the house. I began to feel a knot tightening in the bottom of my stomach as the stranger walked around to the back of the house. Whoever this person was, they definitely weren't supposed to be there. After another couple of seconds, the lights to the outside of the house cut out. It was pitch black, and only the rain alerted me that the camera was still rolling. The video ended after about 9 minutes of rain and darkness. I was now pretty sure that this was not an innocent little project or anything of that nature, and I began to feel stupid for not checking the laptop seller's credibility. Was this person stalking the woman the same person that I met with earlier? Throughout the whole experience, I had a dormant thought in the back of my head to call the police, but I wasn't ready just yet. Reluctantly now, I began the fourth video, 004. It was dark again, but the rain had stopped, and I was left with only silence. Not long after the clip began, I could make out the sound of footsteps on gravel, getting louder as someone was approaching the vehicle. The car door opened and the dome light was turned on, and I could tell that the camera was now on the floor of the car, pointing up towards the roof. I heard some fumbling in the background, and suddenly a thump sounded from the back of the truck. An arm abruptly obstructed the camera's view, and a large tarp could be seen being pulled out of the car. I had only one scenario running through my head, and I hoped it wasn't true. The person picked up the camera and put it back onto the console, and began to back up. They drove for a good 3 minutes before parking in a branched-off road and exiting the car to work on the load they were carrying. 6 minutes after, the car was moved again to a different location, and the camera was picked up and carried underhand away from the car. I could see now that it was the same shit bucket truck that was in front of the seller's house. I was ready to call the cops on this creep when the camera turned toward the house. It was a completely different house than the one I visited. I was a little relieved by this, though it didn't really prove anything. As the fourth video came to an end, I was wondering whether or not I was prepared to see what came next. I can only hope that this was a prank, or at least had a happy ending. 005 began inside the house. It was extremely dark, and the only thing I could make out was a figure that would occasionally walk in front of the camera. It was also quiet for the first few moments, minus the occasional barking of a dog outside. Eventually, a small sound started to appear. The small sound soon escalated to a loud, muffled scream. Shaking and struggling sounds became more apparent as time went on, as well as crying. A light abruptly came on and the camera was lifted and panned to the center of the room, revealing the beaten and bloody woman tied to a chair. From what I could make out, this was, in fact, the woman from the bar. The camera zoomed in on her face for what seemed like an eternity before stopping. I couldn't believe that this was happening. The original hope that this was a movie or something like that had long since diminished. With only one video remaining, I was beginning to fear for my own safety. I locked my door, closed my blinds, and pushed onward. I began 006 with a small hope that this woman was still alive, and that I could have her saved. The final installment of this horror show began in a bathroom setting. The camera was placed on the counter, facing a mirror, in which I could see a door. The only sound I could make was a familiar sound that destroyed my hopes. Power tools. I sat in front of the screen for what felt like hours before the sound stopped. More silence. Then heavy footsteps, accompanied by what sounded like something being dragged. The doorknob turned and the door was pushed open. Out of the darkness of the rest of the house appeared a middle-aged woman, dressed in what I can only describe as lab attire, sporting a respirator and a long pair of rubber gloves. This, for some strange reason, gave me a small amount of relief. In the reflection, the woman struggled to drag something to the bathtub. As she hoisted it into the tub, I could see that it was a large black garbage bag. I felt like I was dreaming. It was like watching a horror movie unfold on the screen. She lifted the bag from the tub, now empty, except for whatever entrails that still dropped out. She picked up the camera and placed it on the ground, facing the tub. On the floor in front of the bathtub was an assortment of corrosive substances and several other empty containers. The woman began to dump the liquids into the tub, which was followed by an awful noise that I can only describe as pop rocks mixed with coke. The video ended, and I was left bewildered and panicked. I finally opened the pictures. The first was a picture of the truck. The second picture was of the girl, tied up before she was beaten. And the third picture brought up a corrupted file notice. But maybe that's a good thing. I managed to keep the two pictures before I handed the laptop over to the police. I was reimbursed my $600 along with a bonus. Apparently the victim was the young girlfriend of the older woman's ex-husband. The older woman was arrested almost a year before, but was freed of all charges due to a lack of evidence. and the ex-husband was incarcerated instead. I guess this was the missing link. I hope this has solved any unanswered questions, although I'm not sure who the man in the flannel jacket was, or how he got a hold of the laptop, or how he owns the same truck as the murderer. I guess I'll just leave that to the police. In the fall of 1987, local news channel WSB-TV2 of Atlanta, Georgia, was attempting to fill a scheduling gap in their Sunday morning lineup. After a few solicitations by local business owners, they decided to allow the young Reverend Marley Sachs to take the available hour block to do a religiously themed show. It premiered October 18th with little promotion. The show was standard religious fare and consisted of the Reverend sitting in a simple chair reading passages from the Bible to the camera and discussing their interpretation and significance to our modern day-to-day life. The show received a reasonable number of views and continued to be shown into early December. It was then that the studio began to receive extremely strange complaints from viewers of words of light with the Reverend Marley Sachs. The calls were from women, and women only, who vaguely referred to uncomfortable feelings they had at very specific intervals during the program. They described feelings of nausea, back pain, dizziness, and blurred vision. These callers, for no discernible reason, were convinced that it was the viewing of this program that was causing these symptoms. It was later determined after 3 weeks of complaints that these feelings were happening at roughly 12-minute intervals during the course of the program. The small studio staff checked all recording equipment, both audio and video, and found nothing faulty. When the Reverend was made aware of these incidents, he merely shrugged and stated, cryptically, that some can't handle the voice of God. The head of the studio, at a loss to explain the cause of these complaints, decided to continue running the program. By February, viewership had dropped sharply, and it was decided to pull the plug on the show. The studio had figured it would be more prudent to spend as much time as possible on the news story that had the other two local networks abuzz: the miscarriage epidemic. Starting sometime in November, the number of healthy pregnant women miscarrying in the Atlanta metropolitan area had reached over 300. The CDC could find no discernible cause for this terrifying occurrence. The Reverend took the show's cancellation with what could only be described as abject indifference. When informed, he made no protest, merely nodded, almost knowingly. He left the studio after the last episode was filmed without so much as a word, and dropped off the face of the earth. No one ever heard from him again, not his former congregation or any member of the church. The studio moved on, filling the slot with an infomercial, and continued to concentrate on the miscarriage story. A year and a half later, an intern at the WSB studios discovered the tapes of the Words of Light and began going through them in an attempt to find stock footage for an upcoming piece the station was doing on the impact religion had on the city. The Atlanta incident, as the miscarriage epidemic became known in medical journals, petered out 3 months after the studio canceled Reverend Sachs' show and had already begun to fade from the public consciousness. As the intern went through the tapes, he accidentally made a disturbing discovery about the footage. While attempting to stop one recording at 10 minutes and 45 seconds, he mistakenly jammed the fast-forward button down. While the footage whizzed by, he attempted to pry up the button with a screwdriver. Just as he succeeded, the tape stopped at 32 minutes and 1 second. The intern actually fell out of his chair when he looked up and saw what was frozen on the screen. The image of a badly decomposed, severed head filled up the entire frame. After he collected himself, he moved the film back a few frames, then forward, and realized that his mind was not playing tricks on him. He began going through the rest of the recording and soon discovered that at exactly 12-minute intervals, the image would appear for 1 frame. Thinking it's some practical joke being played on the new guy, he presented it to one of the film technicians, ready to be mocked. The technician was just as puzzled as he was. No one had touched the footage since the cancellation of the show. After the studio had closed for the night, the intern convinced the tech to help him go through all the tapes of the Words of Light. They discovered that every single episode had the same horrifying anomaly. They also realized that as the show progressed, the image had become more disgusting, as maggots began to eat away at the loose flesh and pieces of hair, and skin seemed to have fallen off exponentially. The tech made clear to the intern what they were seeing was technically impossible, since the film itself showed absolutely no signs of splicing, and he himself had been at every filming of the show and knew of no time when this image could have been inserted into the frame. All of this was presented to the studio head, who, fearing some kind of backlash over allowing this to get onto the air, ordered all the tapes destroyed. He told the intern in the text that he had no interest in knowing who did it at this point, only that covering their collective asses is all that's important now. He deemed that they mentioned this to no one. The tech easily moved on, remembering the incident as a darkly funny personal anecdote, but the intern wouldn't let it go. He made copies of as many tapes as he could before they were wiped, and took them to see if he could find anything else in them that might point to who did this, or why. A week later, he attempted to rope the tech into helping him again, saying that he believed he had discovered something even more disturbing than the images themselves. When the single frames were edited together in chronological order, the head's mouth appeared to be moving as if trying to form words. The tech, fearing for his job, told him to get rid of the copies and not to talk about it again. A week later, police responded to a 911 call made by an elderly woman in one of the Atlanta suburbs at dusk. She had heard horrible noises coming from the next-door neighbor's house, where a young couple lived. She told the emergency responder that the wife was pregnant and that she was terrified that something had happened. When the officers arrived on the scene 20 minutes later, they found no lights on in the windows, and they found the front door ajar. They moved in slowly and made their way into the living room. Inside, they found a young woman, dead, with her abdomen slashed open. The wound was jagged and a trail of blood led from the body to the couch on the far end of the room. There sat her husband, the studio intern, naked, the corpse of his unborn child at his feet, dying. In his hand he held the rusty piece of metal he had used to gut his pregnant wife. The television was on and playing an 18-second loop of silent footage of a decomposing head, mouthing some unintelligible words. The story of the police precinct to this day goes that the intern kept saying under his breath, over and over again as they led him away, "The light of God calls them."
Chilling tales for dark nights.